Welcome to a ride on the outside. MMA is full of people on the inside, but what about the ones that watch from beyond? Welcome to the MMA Outsiders with Tom Albano and Zain Bando on the Empty the Bench Podcast Network.
And welcome to episode number 53 of the MMA Outsiders here on the Empty the Bench Podcast Network. That is Zain. I'm Tom, as always. And Zain, I know I have a bunch of gum next to me, but you know what? This might as well be crow, because I'm going to be eating a lot of it right now. I think a lot of us in the MMA world are eating a lot of crow because, Zain, I didn't think it was going to happen. But you know what? Kevin Garnett once said, anything is possible, shouting it after the Celtics won the finals. And, well, we just got proven that anything is possible, Zain. Did you ever think we were going to sit here today on episode 53 and say Sean Strickland is the new UFC middleweight champion?
No, number one. And number two, did we ever think that we'd be one fight away from potentially having the combination of Colby Covington, Sean O'Malley, and Sean Strickland as UFC champions? I think you'd have a triple no all around. So for those two things alone, you and I are both 0 for 2, as well as probably 99.9% of the MMA community, minus probably some people in Sean Strickland's camp, and then also one crazy bettor that I saw that had the guts to put $1 million on Strickland and won. But before we get into all of that, we want to remind you, make sure to like and subscribe. Make sure to share the MMA Outsiders wherever you can, whether that's YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, etc. Be sure to subscribe to the Empty the Bench Podcast Network and hit the notification bell. That way you don't miss any episode of this show and all of the great programming going on at the Empty the Bench Podcast Network right now, as we are currently in the midst of the entire fall season ramping up, so be sure to do that. Again, my name is Zain Bando. I am a staff writer for bjpen.com. I am also a member, a member, but not for long, a member of the Bellator rankings panel, assuming that things go the way that Tom and I think they're going to go. Hopefully that transitions into me being a PFL rankings contributor, but we'll see what happens there. And then, of course, Tom is to my left. You can find his work over at Fanside and MMA. You could also find his work over on the PFL website, as he will be covering all the happenings with the remainder of the PFL season and so much more. Tom, to get back to your original point, though, UFC 293 is going to be a card that goes down in not just MMA lore, but Australian lore. As we know, the biggest upset in women's MMA history took place in Australia, and arguably one of the biggest upsets, if not the biggest upset in men's UFC history, also took place in Australia. Did that thought initially come to your mind as soon as the fight was over? Because it did for me, and it honestly took me 40 minutes after the fight to dissect what exactly happened, because I think I was just as shocked as you and 99% of the MMA community. What were your initial thoughts on the fight?
Zain, Monday morning came, and I was still trying to process the thought of Sean Strickland is the UFC middleweight champion. It seemed like an absolute improbability. We were laughing, Zain. We were laughing when we were making the pick. We were laughing and saying that, yeah, this is probably going to be a one-sided decision win for Israel Adesanya, and that he was going to be retaining the UFC middleweight championship. No, Sean Strickland managed to... it was a one-sided fight, Zain, but Sean Strickland was the one who was in favor of in a one-sided outing. And I don't think... obviously we had Pereira pulling off the knockout of Israel Adesanya at UFC 281. We had Jan Blachowicz putting on his performance, although it wasn't exactly exciting. But, Strickland just... he dropped him, and he just was in complete control. I, like the judges, Zain, only gave Israel Adesanya one round. I think I gave him the second round, and that was all. And credit where credit is due. Sean Strickland went in when the world was basically I don't know if I can say laughing at him, but laughing at the probability of him becoming the UFC middleweight champion. And he absolutely delivered. Now, as far as upsets go, I actually wrote a thing for Fansided immediately after the fight, talking about where I think this lands on the biggest upsets in UFC history. And I
which I did, which I did read and was very impressed with your sentiment. I think I agreed with most of it. Yeah.
yeah, I put it at number 5. I do think the ones I put above it were Holly Holm's knockout of Ronda Rousey, which you kind of alluded to already. That 100 UFC pay-per-views earlier in Australia, a different part of Australia, that managed to happen. My jaw was on the floor with that one. What
Same
did I
with mine.
put? 3, I put Weidman knocking out Silva, just
Okay.
because with Izzy, obviously he did have the one loss to Pereira, so there was a brief time where he did lose the championship, and this was the first defense of that second reign. Meanwhile, Silva, I mean, he arrived on the UFC, absolutely dominated from the moment he first landed a shot on Chris Levin, and nobody thought that the I think Weidman was only about 10-0 or 11-0 at that point, and nobody thought that really he had a shot. But it was that interest of, could he do it? Matt Serra, I put at number 2 because, I mean, he won a reality show. He won a show about, fighters, UFC fighters who didn't really, were getting another shot basically, getting a title shot. He beat Chris Lytle in the final. I remember a lot of people thinking Lytle should have gotten the nod that night. And then he goes on to face George St. Pierre. Now, obviously, George St. Pierre at that point was not the George St. Pierre that we know of him now, but just judging Zan from how much George St. Pierre went on to accomplish with the UFC, I think that one, even though it was only a blip, it was the one win. It only lasted a year, didn't have a successful title defense. I think credit in all the world has to be given to Matt Serra for that one upset. And then number 1, Zan, I think there is if I've gone through all those, I think everyone knows what number 1 is for me. And that's Juliana Pena submitting Amanda Nunes to become the bantamweight champion. I think that's my top 5. But Sean Strickland, so it's not my number 1, but it's definitely up there.
Yeah, it's an interesting list. The only thing I would have done differently was I think at the moment I would still keep if it was me doing that list, I would have kept Sarah and GSP1 at number 1, but all of those are solid picks. You can't go wrong with any of those. I would argue I don't know what it is odds wise per se, but I thought that George St. Pierre beating Michael Bisping after a 4-year absence and moving up a weight class was big for its time too. Obviously, as I just alluded to, the odds on that could have been much closer than an upset, quote unquote. But still, I think there are a lot of fights that you could put in that number 1 category, and people wouldn't be disappointed. But if you don't have Sean Strickland in at least your top 5, I think you're doing your list wrong, which thankfully you didn't. I think it deserves acknowledgement, and I think it will continue to get acknowledgement. And you don't have to like Sean Strickland. And I want to make this very clear. There are a lot of people that don't like Sean Strickland for one reason or another. He's a very charismatic character, and I'm saying that lightly because there are a lot of adjectives you could use to describe him. But the one thing you can't deny about Sean Strickland is he's willing to fight anybody, anywhere, anytime. He was knocked out by the former UFC middleweight champion in Alex Pereira, was able to bounce back from that. And I think, when you go in and you beat Israel Adesanya, who had been unstoppable since about 2019 or so, and you do it in almost an effortless fashion, winning 4 out of 5 rounds and doing so pretty decisively, I think there's no denying that you don't have to respect or you don't have to like Sean Strickland. You don't have to like his personality, but you have to respect his greatness. And obviously, we're gonna get into it in a minute. But I think regardless of if a rematch is next or a rematch happens down the line, I think it makes that fight all that much bigger. And I actually do think, and this might be a bit of a hot take here, but I do think him beating Adesanya gives the division a bit of a fresher perspective and a perspective that maybe we haven't seen since about 2016 or 2017, where the division is now completely wide open with tons of interesting challengers and a lot of fun fights. It's not dull as it was, near the end of Anderson Silva's reign. So I think there's a lot to be said for his performance. And I think just the way he went in there and he didn't care. And he said the first 10 minutes were gonna be challenging, and they were. And then just the way he was able to use his boxing, just the way he was able to control him against the fence, the way he was able to, get his strikes off first, confuse Adesanya, with the different angles and feints and stuff. I mean, it was a near flawless performance, and it was a performance that I'm sure that Eugene Berryman and every Idiot City Kickboxing is no pun intended. I'm going to literally say, though, they're probably kicking themselves over it because they know that them as a team collectively, they could have won that fight, and they probably just they underestimated them. They were probably looking ahead to DDP, or early to mid 2024, and I just think Izzy took his foot off the gas pedal, and that was really what dictated the pace of the fight. Congrats to Strickland. It's nice to see that somebody from Extreme Couture, is successful again. That's obviously a very hardworking camp, and to see a guy, Las Vegas bred, so to speak, will go in and do that and do it in an old school kind of way to win the middleweight title. It's almost like one of those throwback kind of championship wins in a fight that I think a lot of people won't forget. So,
Absolutely. And as you said, credit has to be given to Strickland where it's due. You may not like him, you may think he's absolutely controversial, you may not like the things he says. I haven't liked some of the things that he has said, but regardless, he is the middleweight champion. And I mean, I remember you and I talking about potentially like autopsying this fight, but Zan, I mean, what really is there to autopsy? Because first of all, the fight proved to be pretty quiet early on, and then yeah, you saw Strickland kind of, trying to keep his distance, and he did. I think that was one thing that Strickland really did well was he won the range game. He knew how to, I know certain people don't like how certain fighters may, try to do all the moseying around the cage, kind of coming off as, you know, oh, trying to run away from the fighter, but running away from their opponent rather. But Strickland, I mean, he was very strategic in which he was keeping his distance. And Adesanya is a very lanky individual. He's got a lot of range with his arms and his legs. But Strickland managed to land. And late in the round, I mean, he absolutely wobbled him. He rocked Adesanya. And San, I think if there had been more time in that fight, in that round, had there been a minute 30 seconds, I think there was a chance Strickland could have gotten the finish in that first round.
yeah, that could have very easily been the case. And I mean, the way he rocked him against the cage, it literally looked like, a stunning first round upset and a potential plus 1,200 bet for some people who were crazy enough to think that was possible, was literally on the table in a 30-second span. I do have to give myself some credit, though I did correctly predict the fight would go over 4.5 rounds. It was a
Mhm.
it was a little bit scary there in rounds 2 and 3, but for those who had the over, congratulations. I just figured, given that Israel Adesanya's past title fight history and with the way Strickland, it takes care of business, that wouldn't go a little longer. But back to your original point, yeah, I mean, it could have very well been stopped in the first round, and I think it just goes to show that Adesanya was going to hang in there until the final bell. And I was getting a little nervous, though. I will say that there was a thought in the back of my head, hey, we're in Australia. He's from, New Zealand and stuff like that. Like I was getting a little nervous that, well, maybe the judges were going to be swayed a certain way, but thankfully the decision was read correctly. Did you have 49-46 as your final scorecard too?
Yeah.
Just like three judges? Because that's how I had it.
Yes, that's how I had it. I had Adesanya winning the second round just because he upped his volume. Third round was a little, was way too quiet. Strickland landed the only real strikes of that whole round. It seemed like an off round just for the fight in general, round 3. And then rounds 4 and 5, I mean, he wobbled Adesanya. It wasn't enough to get the finish, but I mean, Zan, I know I didn't list it in my top 5. I did list it in that article as an honorable mention. But what I think of this fight now, obviously, Sean Strickland, Randy Couture, two completely different circumstances. But I think to that Randy Couture, Tim Sylvia fight, in which you don't think that, most people didn't think that Randy Couture was going to have a shot. And then all of a sudden he rocks Sylvia in the first round. And then it's an absolutely one-sided, unanimous decision into a title win that, left people's jaws on the floor. Kind of similar, kind of mirroring what happened in this fight. Obviously, a little different of circumstances, but I think the premise at least sounds similar.
Well, somewhat similar in a sense too. I know we're turning back the clock a little bit for those who may not be familiar with UFC 68, but if you remember going into UFC 68, that card was being crapped on to a degree like I had never seen at the time. Everybody was like, "Oh, Tim Sylvia is going to go in. He's going to run through Randy Couture. This is easy." He's already thinking ahead to a potential fight with Mirko Cro Cop because at the time the UFC had brought in Mirko Cro Cop to, to streamline the heavyweight division, if you will, make it a little bit more competitive. This had an eerily similar feeling to it now that you're mentioning it, and it's just ironic to see that they're both from the same camp. Of course, obviously, one of them is obvious; it's named after him. But to see, to see, to see an eventual training partner, if will slash newer champion of the sport go in and do something similar to someone who many thought was unbeatable, similar to Sylvia at heavyweight at the time. It's very interesting to think about, and just looking at it from a past history perspective. I mean, I guess you could also allude it to another fight you can compare it to is Miesha Tate versus Holly Holm. I mean, if you remember going into that one, it didn't seem like a lot of people were giving Miesha Tate a chance, and she had a miracle rear naked choke in the 5th round that no one was expecting either. So I think it just goes to show that Extreme Couture has a bit of a knack for just finding these kind of miracle openings and just just shocking the world. And I'm not saying Strickland's performance was a miracle, but when you look at it from a betting perspective, and you look at it from comparing both of their resumes side by side, I think you and I can both agree wholeheartedly that Adesanya's fought the tougher and more strategic competition, if you will, compared to Strickland. But I think the UFC just the UFC just being the UFC, you could tell if you zoomed in enough, or if you pay close attention, you could tell that on some level the UFC wasn't very happy with this, and we're going to get into it as a subtopic here in a second. But I think it just goes to show the vibes in this middleweight division, and quite frankly, all the title shakeups. There's now been 9 different ones this year. We have a chance for a 10th this coming weekend in Vegas. I think it just goes to show that sometimes the UFC can't even keep up with how crazy the madness is. Because if you remember 4 episodes ago or 5 episodes ago, we were talking about how, the UFC, is dropping the ball here. This should have never been a pay-per-view in Australia. It should be the DDP fight. Now all of their ends are slowly but surely going by the wayside, unless what we're going to talk about next comes to fruition, which I know you probably have a very strong opinion about. So,
yeah, absolutely. Also, by the way, funny you mentioned Mirko Cro Cop, because 2 pay-per-views later, he becomes the victim of his own absolute shocking upset with Randy Couture on commentary, where Gabriel Gonzaga knocks him out cold, clean in the cage. So, I mean, the UFC should be used to this by now, used to just the absolute shocking happen. But I mean,
another international card, I might add.
yeah, it goes to show you that they're just have these trends with the UFC. Now, credit also to Adesanya, who, he didn't argue the decision. The judges that you mentioned got it right. And Adesanya, very graceful, you can say, in defeat. I mean, what else is there to say? Sean Strickland Sean Strickland shocks the world. Yes, I'm going to use the alliteration there with the constant S's, but that is pretty much what the story of mixed martial arts has been the last few days. Is just reveling and just, shaking how Sean Strickland is the champion. I mean, Zan, I may mention Juliana Pena being my number one pick for my top upset in UFC history. And this is giving off that same kind of vibe. And that was just a couple of years ago where, Monday morning, as I said, comes around and I'm like, did I really just watch that a couple of nights ago? But the reality is, yes, Sean Strickland is the middleweight champion. Absolute amazing showing. And it's kind of like what I alluded to uh, when I was talking with you. And for those who aren't aware, we're recording this, and New York is getting absolutely slammed with a storm. So my lights just managed to flicker for a second. Um, as I was, like the lights are kind of flickering on some of the UFC's international plans right now with UFC Africa, and we'll talk about Noche UFC coming up. Um, my point being, though, that I told you, I was texting you that even if Adesanya got the biggest judges robbery in the history of the UFC, that I was going to have some questions. And at this point, I do have questions about Israel Adesanya, which uh, I should lead us now into this next little subtopic of such about an immediate rematch. And well, Zan, on one hand, you have the fact that it's Israel Adesanya, who was at the top of the division for, I think, 4 years, minus that one stretch where, obviously, as I mentioned before, Pereira had pulled off the shocking fifth round knockout and was middleweight champion for all of about 4 or 5 months. And up other than that, it was been all Adesanya. On the other hand, you can look at that Pereira loss and then say, you know, he lost to Blachowicz. He ended up getting another one or two title defenses, lost to Pereira, regained the title, and one could maybe make the argument about Pereira winning the first round of that rematch. And now here, he got his butt whooped. And Zan, that leads me to the other hand, is that this is now two losses in his last three fights. This second reign doesn't have a successful defense. He has as many successful title defenses in this second title reign as Alex Pereira did. So right now you could argue, Zan, we have a case of division hot potato. And I just think back to, and mentioned it there, UFC President Dana White is interested in having, an immediate rematch, and I can understand why, especially considering the UFC's plans that they wanted Israel Adesanya versus Dricus du Plessis, and you know how much I wanted that fight. But I think to Dana's words when Nunes ran through Cyborg, that was a one-sided ass whooping, and just to be blunt, and at one-sided ass whoopings, I think you can make a case of. I'm usually am for immediate rematches, but when it's a case like we saw on Saturday night, that's when I gotta hesitate and say, really, should it be? Plus, I know Dana's claiming, Dricus du Plessis didn't want the fight, and then, doing that whole smear campaign because he turned down the fight, which, number one, I think I've preached it enough on this show already. How you thought the winner of Robert Whittaker versus Dricus du Plessis was going to be ready to face Israel Adesanya in 9 weeks is just balderdash, and that's a nice word that I can say to avoid cursing. And number two, I mean, considering what just happened in that kind of situation, I feel like you owe it to du Plessis. That was a contenders fight, and he beat a former champion Whitaker. I feel like you can't just take away the title shot from du Plessis, especially when, as I mentioned, Adesanya has now lost two of his last three.
Yeah, again, those are all very valid points, but I will say this. You have to remember who you're dealing with here. You're dealing with the biggest MMA promotion in the world. They're gonna go for where the biggest fights are. So I think now there's a case where you kind of have a four-horse race a little bit if you think about it. You got Izzy, you got Sean Strickland, you got DDP, and you got Alex Pereira. This is now setting up a perfect scenario where it's going to be a bit of a round robin, so to speak, to where they're all gonna start fighting each other now, whether it's second fights and third fights and fourth fights and fourth fights and what have you. But now that we keep mentioning the heavyweight division and the way it used to be, obviously this isn't heavyweight. We're talking about 185. This is giving me vibes of the era where you had Sylvia Miran Orlovsky, and they're all just fighting each other, and now we're starting to go down that same path. My point in saying that is, I think the UFC is in a situation where they need time to fill cards. According to Dana, they have cards filled up or planned out, so to speak, until March. So the UFC has a scenario now where they can do one of two things. They could say, look, we're okay with Sean Strickland winning the fight. It is what it is. We have to live with it. We have an open date for Super Bowl weekend. You do Strickland versus Adesanya in Vegas, or you wait and you somehow, some way, try to figure it out with the powers that be to still somehow, some way salvage a UFC Africa card and a DDP versus Sean Strickland in Africa. Although that's not what the UFC wants, they keep preaching every couple of months, oh, we're gonna do an Africa card, we're gonna do an Africa card. You had alluded to me that UFC Africa is dead. I don't think it is, because you still have DDP waiting in the wings. Is it obviously better if DDP fights Adesanya for money, power, business, etc.? Of course it is, but I think you have to play the cards that you're dealt, and these are the cards that they're dealt. And I think even though DDP is waiting in the rings, I think now with Adesanya losing, Adesanya versus Strickland 2 just became an even bigger fight. The build-up's going to be bigger, and if they do it in Vegas, which is Strickland's backyard, technically, I think it has a chance to be a very, very successful middleweight title rematch. And that's a rematch that I want to see, because I am curious to see if Israel Adesanya can correct the mistakes that plagued him in this fight. Although on the other side of the equation, an argument for him, not to have an immediate rematch, is also one of those things where that could be possible too. Because of course now you have to look at a scenario in the sense that Adesanya is 4-3 in his last 7. So would you really want someone who's 4-3 in his last 7 to keep getting title fights over and over and over again? That's the other side of the coin you have to look at too. So I think the UFC can go in a lot of different directions, but I think what makes logical sense from a business perspective is to do Strickland versus Adesanya 2 in Vegas as a potential headliner or co-headliner the weekend of the Super Bowl.
In that case, then what do you do if you're Dricus du Plessis? Because I feel like he has a right to feel kind of robbed, but of course, I mean, just how the cards kind of play out, because we were sitting here thinking Strickland has no shot, and now all of a sudden Strickland is here. And I mean, you had alluded to when our text where I said that basically UFC Africa is dead, and I'll pretty much say it like this. I feel like the UFC's plans about a UFC Africa and Adesanya versus DDP, they have no one to blame but themselves. They honestly don't have anybody to blame but themselves. I mean, I've said it before on this show. What the hell were they doing thinking of putting Australia, an Australia card in September for a pay-per-view? Zan, we were sitting here 4 or 5 weeks ago. We still had no idea what the main event of that pay-per-view was going to be. It took us a while before we finally got an answer. Oh, by the way, if Dana says that they have all these cards planned out through February or through March, what's the December main event then? What's December 16th? Come on, give us the answer.
I mean, one can hope that it's announced this weekend during Noche UFC. You would think, because Noche UFC is in Vegas, so it would be the perfect time to announce what the heck.
It would be 3 months exact. It would be 3 months exact to the day, December 16th.
Mm-hmm. Literally. Which I think we know what the answer is going to be, but I'm not holding my breath. So,
I know, I know, but my point, Zan, is I feel like this is to the unfortunate, to the unfortunate burden of one DDP, and you know how big of a DDP fan I am, is that this is a case of karma. The UFC tried to get Dricus Duplessis, and Robert Whitaker would have been in the same kind of scenario, ready for a September Australia card. They tried to rush it, and it ended up biting them in the ass, plain and simple.
yeah,
So,
it
it,
did. You could have, now that you think of it, you could have easily had JDM fight Kevin Holland in the UFC Fight Night card in Australia, and it is now Noche UFC 293 with Valentina Shevchenko and Alexa Grasso as the main event. You could have done that too.
honestly, they kind of screwed up, and now they have damaged. I respect your opinion that UFC Africa isn't dead, and they're trying to insist on it, but I definitely think it's damaged,
Oh, it
and
is for sure.
they've damaged this market. Zan, you could argue that by the end of this weekend, we'll get to this weekend in a little bit, but you could argue that there is a chance they could have damaged three international markets by the end of this weekend. UFC Africa, I mean, Saudi
UFC
Arabia,
Mexico.
right? UFC Mexico. Obviously, if Grasso loses her belt back to Shevchenko, if Raul Rosas Jr. loses his fight, and Zan, you could even argue maybe Saudi Arabia to a degree. I know they have invested a little bit in the UFC. I think it's something like a 10%, but you think about how the PFL just got that heavy investment from the country. I mean, you know, right now the international perspectives, it's not a good look for the UFC.
No, no, it isn't. That's for sure. But I will say this: at least the UFC is somewhat holding up their end of the bargain, because they could have very easily said, "Oh no, we're not going to pursue Africa anymore," or "Oh no, we're not going to pursue a mega UFC Mexico event anymore." So they're at least trying, but they're realizing, "Oh shoot, we micromanaged this too much, and our window is starting to close." That's something to consider as 2024 draws closer, because Tom, if UFC Mexico does not happen in 2024, if UFC Africa doesn't happen in 2024, if a major UFC event in Saudi Arabia that's not Abu Dhabi doesn't happen in 2024, like a major soccer stadium Saudi Arabia show, then all three of those windows are dead if they don't happen by 2024.
And Dana White once commented, if you remember Zan, back at Raul Rosas Jr.'s last fight after loss, he said, "We're bleeping up the Mexican market." Well, they're going to be continue to bleeping up international markets if they don't get their bleep together.
Yeah, and they're screwing it up, if you will, by only we're going to get into this more in a little bit, but they're only screwing it up more so by or not keeping Raul Rosas Jr. as active as he once hoped he would be. But that's also another issue to consider too, considering that the lack of Hispanic UFC stars, so to speak, it just isn't what it once as when Cain Velasquez was the champion. I know we're digressing a little bit. The fact of the matter is, though, is the internationalism of the UFC, or how they try to pride themselves on it, is getting very, very, very weary, as some of their major international stars are starting to lose, and Adesanya losing at the top, as well as Kamaru Usman no longer being champion, and Francis Ngannou being in the PFL. A potential mega UFC Africa card is down to none. So it's a little bit unfortunate.
Here's where Zan,
No UFC African champions at the moment. So
yeah, it's amazing we've gone from 3 to 0 in a really quick fashion. And Zan, here's where all of that is going. That's basically what it is at this point.
it's true,
All
and the
right.
clock and the clock is still ticking. I might add.
Yeah. All right. Let's quickly go over the rest of the main card here. Alexander Volkov defeating Tai Tuivasa. I mean, credit to Ty. He tried to make it some sort of a fight. I'll take his social media post. He walked out to a song called Scar. He's the one who ended up with a scar. It was a pretty brutal beating. Volkov got him to the ground. The ground and pound was too much. But I think Alexander Volkov is in a really unique kind of situation because this was a 6 versus 7 fight. He wins, but you got Jones versus Stipe in November. You've got Zen, I think they teased it last time at UFC Paris, a potential Cyril Gane versus Tom Aspinall fight waiting in the wings. Speaking of waiting in the wings, Sergey Pavlovich is waiting in the wings for a potential heavyweight title fight, regardless of what happens. If Jones retains the title and then Pavlovich is next, or Jones retires and then Pavlovich gets inserted into a vacant title fight. Zen, I think Alexander Volkov, especially considering he's still probably 2 wins away from a crack at the heavyweight title. He might have to play. He might have to play the good old waiting game.
Yeah, I'll have to play the waiting game for sure. And one potential fight you didn't mention, Tom, was could you see a scenario where Tom Aspinall will be fighting Sergey Pavlovich for the vacant UFC heavyweight title if Jones and Stipe both happen to hang it up at Madison Square Garden on November 11th?
I mean, that's a real possibility. That is a real possibility. So, what would you do with Volkov at that point? Would you match up?
I would say do him versus the winner of the Curtis Blades fight in Brazil.
Blades versus Almeida. Yeah, that's an interesting one because I was going to say I think Gunn and Volkov had fought before, haven't they?
They have.
Yeah, so I was going to say I don't know. I think of Volkov. I think your idea of Volkov versus the Blades Almeida winner is better for that situation. But as of the current situation and going on the situation of we don't know if Jones or Stipe is going to be heavyweight champion next. We don't know if Jones is going to truly retire. We assume he's going to retire, but in the case he doesn't, for Volkov right now, it's waiting game central.
No, it's true. So then, therefore, if Jones doesn't retire, and let's assume that Jones beats Stipe and doesn't retire, is Jones Pavlovich next in your opinion? Because I think it is. Yeah.
Yep. Big time.
And then if Stipe beats Jones, but neither of them retire, do you do a rematch or do you move on?
Zan, I'm going to use a sound effect because you just told me that the UFC always pursues these kind of fights, and you said that a Strickland Adesanya rematch would be. So what makes you think that a Stipe versus Jones rematch would not be?
Oh, it would be huge. And you know how Dana keeps talking about markets they haven't been to in a long time. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. There's 2 Midwestern cities who are dying for a pay-per-view. Oh, could you please bring the rematch to Chicago or Ohio? Then I would be interested.
See, this is where I need more sound effects because this is where I would insert Stipe yell, "All right!"
Oh man!
All right, the rest of the card. Felipe Manel Koff defeats Felipe Dos Santos. Credit to Dos Santos. He brought the fight. This ends up being the fight of the night winner. Koff gets the win. Pretty needed win. And then he calls out Kai Kara France. And he and Radke both get into some hot water by using anti-gay.
Yeah. Yeah, if you want to talk about ugly, that was ugly in large capital letters. And I have to call out ESPN for a second because they should have been I understand not being quick on the first one, but they should have been much quicker on the second one. And I honestly think that was a production gaffe that they should have remedied. Obviously, it doesn't take away from what either guy said. It's obviously horrible, but yeah, just absolutely disgusting. And to hear Dana White's tone deaf response to it was atypical. I was not I was not surprised, but considering that he's gotten into his own hot water himself, you would think after about maybe 12 or 13 years they would know a little better, but apparently the UFC is still in the UFC, I guess.
Zan, remember what Dana once said? It's the fight game. People say mean things to each other.
I guess that adds to the pot of that statement, unfortunately.
That's basically what it is. Hear
Yeah.
no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. Uh, and speaking of evil, well, this was a pretty evil knockout. Justin Tafa. I mean, now I shouldn't say. I mean, on the official fight time, it was just over a minute. We did have an official timeout, however, after I poke and I said, "Oh no, not again, not again with this." But Tafa was able to, but Tafa and Lane ended up going on, and yeah, I mean, Tafa just laid waste to Lane.
Tom, I was envisioning you falling out of your chair as the kick landed because I was like, no, not again, no way, absolutely no way.
Uh, just I'm glad that the fight actually ended up played out as it did. Not surprised, Tafa, the country guy, gets the knockout victory, very quick fashion. And actually, I'm not surprised that was Tafa who came out on top, as much as I, kind of maybe alluded to a coin flippish kind of pick last week. But I mean, Tafa, his brother was in Glory Kickboxing. The two are good kickboxers, so credit in the world to Justin Tafa for getting the win there. Uh, and Tyson Pedro, speaking of country guys and quick knockouts, Tyson Pedro getting the main card started in a big way. I liked Anton Turkal's walkout. I like his nickname, but obviously Tyson Pedro's in a different league.
Yeah, I was initially wrong on this pick, as you saw in our official card sheets. I changed my pick, and I'm glad I did. This was a very easy win for Pedro, and definitely nice to get one in front of his hometown, if you will. I think Anton's going to be back, as I said, but he'll probably have a lot to work on. It's because if you watch the fight holistically, it was not competitive at all. So, um, good win for Pedro. Very unfortunate for Turkoglu there, and it's just one of those where you have to go back to the drawing board if there even is one. Maybe the UFC is so disappointed that they might either give him a tougher opponent or they might consider giving him the axe. But given how relatively green he still is in his career, I highly doubt it.
And that's pretty much going to be it for UFC 293. Although, Zan, you wanted to bring this up. More technical issues with the UFC and DSPN Plus. So,
Yeah,
yay.
yeah. Just briefly, I saw at least 5 tweets from people saying that either A, they couldn't order the fight, or B, that they ordered the fight and they literally could not watch the first 30 minutes because they had a blue screen. Literally, and I think there was a viral photo that went around. I think it was Ben Davis that tweeted it during the prelims. That literally the ESPN Plus feed went out, and apparently for some people they weren't able to watch the fight at all as late as into the walkouts of the main event. Some more technical issues for ESPN Plus, despite despite the whole Spectrum debacle coming to an end earlier yesterday. But still, very, very disappointing to see that we're at UFC 293 and we're over 3.5 years into this ESPN Plus deal, and there are still more technical issues to be had. And for those that are listening to this that are considering buying UFC 294, you can do so right now. Actually, is that event is obviously over a month away, but still some more issues going on over there on the ESPN Plus side, which obviously, if you want more on our discussion on that, you could go back and listen to last week's episode. Tom, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, so I actually want to update to that story that we talked about last week. So I did a little digging when you mentioned, UFC 294 can be bought pretty early. And, I was digging around. So the UFC, I should say UFC, the ESPN has put a little disclaimer when you're searching for that card and you're looking at buying it. It mentions that on October 12th, Zan, as the individual, the representative from ESPN Plus customer support told you, that we were correct, that they are going to be raising the bundle price of the ESPN Plus, Disney Plus, Hulu package from $18.99 to $23.99 a month. It also mentions, Zan, that ESPN Plus is going to be going up by $1 from $9.99 a month to $10.99 a month if you don't have the bundle. If you pay for the year, I think it's going up $10. However, UFC pay-per-view prices are going to stay the same. So UFC 294 will remain $79.95. I suspect, Zan, that's just for now, and then by year end, if not the start of next year, they're going to raise it again.
Yeah, I could see them raising it again too, just before what would be UFC 297. So just keep pretty much what we're saying is keep an eye out for any price hikes and see how you can save your money if you can, either by using the movie theater method we alluded to, or going to a establishment that has the UFC. And then by no way am I sponsored by the UFC in saying this. You can easily go to bars.ufc.com, type in your zip code in your area, and it'll show you every single bar or local establishment in that zip coded area that carries every single UFC pay-per-view, and at select locations, ESPN Plus cards, and at select locations, Power Slap cards. So you're covered by any means necessary when it comes to anything related to the UFC.
Dana, are you sure you don't want to put some sponsorship into this show? You don't want to invest in this show? Because I think Zan did a nice plug for us. Oh, by the way, I'll keep it even more simple. Find your local Buffalo Wild Wings or your local Dave and Buster's or something that'll air it.
Yeah, and usually at most of them they will air every single pay-per-view because of their respective contracts with Johan Promotions, who is the longest running pay-per-view distributor in America. So nonetheless, whatever establishment you go to, you will be in good hands. So
one story before we get to Noche UFC, Zan. Nina Agdal, the love interest, I believe they are fiancés of Logan Paul, has placed a lawsuit against Dillon Danis and filing a restraining order and looking for jail time because of all of Dillon Danis' social media posts. Meanwhile, Danis has launched a suit against Logan Paul for essentially defamation of character.
yeah, I mean, the only thing I could say about this is, and I'm just going to say it, so I apologize for the language here, but this is becoming a shit show, and the only thing I can really say is, don't hold your breath, because October 14th, the scheduled fight between Logan Paul and Dillon Danis, don't expect it to occur. If I'm DAZN, I'm already in PR disaster mode. I'm already figuring out a way that I can salvage the card somehow, some way. So if you're interested in the Dillon Danis Logan Paul fight, I would not bake on that occurring, given all of the legal proceedings that are going on. And I think the biggest loser in this whole thing is actually DAZN, because now they have to deal with all the crap that's going to come along with all of this. So where do you go? After DAZN takes 2 steps forward, as they usually do, they take 3 steps back, and this is just the latest in that ongoing saga. So
I can't wait, Zan, to see if we ever get the numbers about whatever the Canelo pay-per-view, the Canelo fight is going to be at the end of the month. I mean, Zan, really, this whole thing is, you kind of said it, it's a shit show. It's a shit show of
emotional damage.
That's basically what this feud between Logan Paul and Dillon Danis has become. And
wait,
I don't know.
correct me if I'm wrong. I thought Canelo versus Charlo was just a PBC show.
Or maybe it is just a PBC. My point, Zan,
Okay.
my point is that, as you kind of alluded to, DAZN just continues to take step backward after step backward, and they are really showing, Zan, that they are second in competition to ESPN Plus with the UFC PFL. Zan, I'll be pretty honest. If I start to cut some corners, and remove some subscription, DAZN might be number 1 at this point, because honestly, they might be the most expensive one, but there's no bang for your buck with them.
Yeah, I canceled mine like 7 months ago, and I have no regrets at all.
Good. I might be on that same boat, because DAZN, Logan Paul, Dillon Danis, Zan, I have a song I should play for them that we use on ETV Sports and the Football Friday and all of that. This is the circus tent music. Zan, I only usually bring this out when I'm bringing up the segment called Broncos Country, Let's Ride, because the Broncos are an absolute disaster. But you know what? This fight is proving to be just as much of a disaster.
I guess you could say the zone. No, I got one. The Zone Misfits Nation. Let's ride. Oh, jeez.
All right. All right. Let's move on from the Misfits. Let's go on to the actual competitions at hand. Let's talk about Noche UFC or UFC Vegas 80 or whatever it's being called this weekend. Yes, you're not reading this wrong if you didn't hear about this card. Yes, this is going to be a fight night headlined by a championship fight. The first time, Zan, that I think a fight night is holding a championship card since
UFC on ESPN +1 with Dillashaw and Cejudo.
No, I think wasn't the first fight between Benavidez and Davison, wasn't that an ESPN Plus card?
That's right. That was during fight. Yeah, exactly.
Actually, you're right. Both fights were ESPN Plus cards for those flyweight fights.
This is, but what this is a first for is it is the first UFC fight night main event title fight in Las Vegas of the ESPN Plus era. So
correct. Because the last time the women's flyweight title was on the line, obviously you made mention of the two men's flyweight title fight, one being on Fight Island. The other was the February 29th, 2020 card, which I forget where that one took place. And then the last time the women's flyweight title was on the line, Valentina was the champ, Carmouche was the challenger, and that took place somewhere overseas.
I'm pretty sure, yeah, that sounds right. Probably, I think it was Canada. Or was it not Canada?
So February 29th, 2020, the first fight between Benavidez and Davison, that was in Virginia. That was in Norfolk.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then the August 2019 card that Carmouche and Shevchenko headlined. Let me go to the events list here. That was in Uruguay. That was in Montevideo.
Oh, that's right, because it had a weird start time, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. Nevertheless, we've got a big title fight this weekend. You know, right after we just had one of the biggest upsets in UFC history, we're now revisiting a major upset from earlier in this year in which Alexa Grasso submitted Valentina Shevchenko to become
in the same building that the rematch is going to take place in. That's pretty ironic.
Yeah. So, I mean, Zan, you look at this fight and I'm wondering, I mean, Shevchenko, was that one fight against Grasso, was that just an off night? Do you have now questions about Shevchenko like I have about Izzy? Do you think, Grasso's just going to be a one and done and then Shevchenko, gets back to her old ways with this fight? Does Grasso have the game plan that in order to defeat Shevchenko?
This is going to be an all-out war. This is going to be one of those fights that I think if you don't watch this fight, you're going to regret it. I think these are the two best flyweights in the world by far. I think Valentina has a chip on her shoulder, something to prove, and I don't see how she loses this one. All I know is that it's going to be action-packed from the second the fight starts until it's over. I like Valentina and her experience here. I think Grasso's submission game is solid, but I like Valentina in the third round via TKO. I just think she's on a mission. She said it in an interview a week ago. She vows to destroy Alexa Grasso. I believe her. In case you don't remember, when Valentina Shevchenko isn't beating the crap out of people, she is a mini spy, so to speak. So of course she's gonna have something up her sleeve that nobody knows about, and I'm sure it's either gonna be a vicious knockout or it's gonna be a submission that people are not gonna see coming in. It's going to be one of those finishes to me that's going to be replayed over and over and over and over and over again. All I know is this. If you're the UFC, you were hoping Valentina Shevchenko wins this fight because a trilogy between those two would be absolutely electric. That's for sure.
And, Zan, I'll throw it out there because I threw it out there a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about Weili Zhang. I mean, Zan, the idea of a Shevchenko Weili Zhang super fight also sounds pretty good in my opinion.
For sure. I think it all depends on how this fight goes, though.
So your official prediction is going to be
Shevchenko third round TKO to regain her flyweight championship. I think she finishes Grasso in vicious fashion.
and I'm going to agree with you. I think Shevchenko puts on an absolutely dominating display. Zan, I don't want to discredit Alexa Grasso because Alexa Grasso had her moment. It was a major upset earlier this year, but I feel like Shevchenko just had an off night. It wasn't the Shevchenko we were used to seeing. And I think Shevchenko, now that, as you mentioned, she has the chip on her shoulder, is going to rebound in a big way. And I am going to say, Zan, I'm going to agree with you, a third or fourth round finish. If not, it's going to be an absolute one-sided beatdown in which Valentina Shevchenko regains the title. And Zan, the karma for the UFC will continue as now, the Mexican market is going to get hit with Alexa Grasso losing her title just because that's the path it seems like we kind of alluded to earlier that is going to be going down.
Well said. I mean, as we know, this is the fight that's taking place on Saturday. But Tom, let's hypothetically say because we have to do this because we have to prepare for anything and everything. A potential backup fighter. If you were to guess who the backup would be for this fight, who would it be and why? In your opinion,
A backup fighter. Ugh.
Is it Aaron Blanchfield? What do you?
I could see Blanchfield, but I mean, I mean, you look at the rest of the card. Yeah, there has to be some sort of backup fighter. It probably Blanchfield.
Okay.
Obviously, I don't think the UFC wants to go that route. However, of course.
And something we forgot to clarify at the beginning of the segment: all of these fights are exclusively on ESPN Plus. Main card has a traditional pay-per-view start time of 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific. I'm almost positive with the prelims beginning at shortly before that, or it actually could be a little bit later. I could be wrong. It might be a 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m.
I think it's a 7 p.m. I think it's a 7 p.m.
Okay, yeah, 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. Main card start with the prelims. Okay, so that makes sense. Again, exclusive to ESPN Plus. This is one of those rare cards where it is a main event with a title on the line that is not a pay per view.
Yeah.
If you want to call it a mini UFC 293.5, I guess you could go with that.
I think that's pretty much what it is. Just to go over a couple more fights, by the way, very quickly, just to make mention, co-main event, as you alluded to before, you got Kevin Holland, the big mouth, taking on Jack Della Maddalena. I think this is a big opportunity here for JDM. Is Holland going to be too much for him, though?
Yeah, I think Kevin Holland in Vegas just turns up the notch a little bit. I think he's going to learn from his previous Vegas experience, getting absolutely dominated by Hamza Chimaev a year ago, and I think he comes back, makes do on his mini revenge, so to speak, and beats the hottest Australian prospect probably since George Sonoropoulos. So I think you're going to see the best Kevin Holland we've ever seen in the UFC thus far, and I think either late first, early second round finish over JDM. But again, like you said, a very big step up in competition.
And then also make mention, because I mentioned him earlier, Raul Rosas Jr., he's going to be taking on Terrence Mitchell. I know he's so young into his career, and he's so young just in general, but after his last loss, I don't want to say must win, but it's not going to be a good look if he loses this one, right?
No, it's not going to be a good look at all, especially in front of his people. I mean, obviously the UFC is billing this as Noche UFC, Mexican Independence Day weekend. Raul Rosas Jr. is someone that the UFC wants to build that market around. So this would be a really bad loss. Obviously, Terrence Mitchell was no slouch, but I think Raul Rosas Jr. learned from his mistakes in his last fight, comes back in a big way, gets a finish over Terrence Mitchell, and ignites the what should presumably be a pro Mexican UFC crowd that night, and puts on the best performance of his young career so far. Now, not only is this a must win, but I think if you want to place a bet that's sure to hit, I think a Raul Rosas Jr. either prop by finish or Raul Rosas Jr. money line might be your best approach there if you're looking at just a single fight. So even though we did hit the hour mark, that's going to do it for the MMA Outsiders. We really didn't have a lot to cover this week, just considering there was a lack of news in a smaller UFC event we had to cover. Before we get out of here again, make sure to like and subscribe. Be sure to follow the Empty the Bench podcast network everywhere across social media at ETB Network, and follow the MMA Outsiders at MMA Outsiders ETB. Reintroducing ourselves one last time. My name is Zain Bando. You can find my work over at bjpen.com. I am also at Bellator Rankings, and the list for Bellator, at least for the time being, I would presume. And then, of course, to my left is Tom Albano. You can find his work over at Fansided MMA and all of the PFL goodies over on the PFL website on fight nights and so on and so forth. So be sure to check out his work there. We have a few kind of duller weeks in the MMA space before we get into a crazy October, so please bear with us. And again, thank you for tuning in to yet another episode of the MMA Outsiders. This has been episode 53. And before we get out of here and before we tell you guys to enjoy the fights, be Joe Pyfer.
Be Joe Pyfer. See you next time, everyone.
See you next week. And thank you again.